The year was 1875, and the West was still wild, untamed, and full of promise. Emily, a young girl of about 18, had moved with her family to a small homestead nestled on the outskirts of a rugged frontier town. It was a hard life, one that demanded constant work from sunup to sundown. Her father, a determined man with a strong will, had decided to leave the crowded cities behind and try to make a living on the vast plains of the American West. He had hoped that the land would provide, but the reality was far different. The land was unforgiving, the winters harsh, and the isolation was more than Emily had imagined. Her father had brought the family to this remote homestead to build a new life. But the challenges were endless. There were always crops to tend to, animals to care for, and wood to chop. Emily worked as hard as anyone, often taking care of the household chores, cooking meals, and helping her mother where she could. Yet, despite her efforts, the struggle was relentless. The winds howled at night, the cold seeped into their bones, and food was always scarce, especially as the winter months approached. It was on a day like any other, when Emily's father had gone to town for supplies, that she found herself heading into town as well. She had been tasked with bringing back what little they could afford: flour, sugar, salt, and a few tools that were needed on the farm. Emily had never minded these trips, even though the town was a good hour away by wagon. It was a chance for her to stretch her legs, see something other than the small, isolated homestead, and perhaps even speak to other people. She often found herself feeling lonely, longing for something more than the quiet life of a settler. She set out early in the morning, with the sky still dim and the sun only beginning to rise over the plains. The cold air bit at her face as she guided the horse-drawn wagon down the narrow, bumpy dirt road. The wheels creaked as they turned, and the sound of hooves on the ground echoed through the stillness. The landscape around her was both beautiful and intimidating. A wide open stretch of land dotted with patches of grass and sparse trees, all framed by distant mountains that seemed to go on forever. Emily had grown used to the sight, but it never ceased to leave her in awe. It was as if the land itself held a certain magic, a beauty that only those who lived here could fully understand. When she finally reached the town, it was still early enough that most people were just starting their day. The small frontier town had a few wooden buildings, including a general store, a blacksmith, and a small saloon. Dust swirled in the streets, kicked up by the wind and the occasional wagon. The air smelled of horses, leather, and earth. Emily tied her horse to a post and stepped down from the wagon, feeling the stiff chill of the morning in her bones. She made her way into the general store, the creaky door swinging open with a soft squeak. Inside, the shelves were lined with all sorts of goods: canned food, flour sacks, bolts of cloth, and tools. The store was warm, the smell of wood and spices filling the air. Behind the counter stood an older man with a thick, gray beard and a kind smile. His name was Mr. Harris, and he had seen many people come and go over the years. "Good morning, Miss Emily," he called out as she entered. Emily smiled, walking toward the counter. "Morning, Mr. Harris. I need some flour, sugar, and salt, and maybe a few nails for the barn roof. It's still leaking, and Father's been too busy to fix it." Mr. Harris nodded, gathering the items for her. As he did, Emily's eyes wandered around the store, taking in the familiar sights. But something caught her eye, something different from the usual routine. Standing by the back wall of the store was a man she had never seen before. He was tall, his shoulders broad, and his face weathered by years spent working outdoors. His clothes were simple, dusty jeans, a worn shirt, and a brown hat that shadowed his eyes. But it wasn't just his appearance that caught Emily's attention. There was something about him, something in the way he moved, the way he stood with a quiet confidence, as though he were a part of the land itself. The man turned then, and their eyes met for a brief moment. Emily felt a sudden rush of warmth spread through her, though she couldn't explain why. His gaze was calm, almost searching. But it held a certain sadness, too, as if he had lived through things that most people could not understand. It was a look that stirred something deep inside her, something she couldn't quite put into words. She quickly looked away, feeling a little embarrassed by the unexpected feeling. Mr. Harris continued to gather her items, and the man slowly made his way toward the counter. As he passed Emily, he nodded in acknowledgement, his gaze never leaving hers for too long. "Morning, miss," he said in a low voice. His voice was rough, as if it had been weathered by the wind and sun of many long days. "I'm Jack," he added, tipping his hat slightly. "Hello," Emily replied, her voice sounding smaller than she intended. "I'm Emily." He gave her a small, knowing smile before turning to Mr. Harris. They exchanged a few words, and Emily stood there, feeling a strange flutter in her chest. She had never met anyone quite like him before. There was something about the way he carried himself, a kind of quiet strength that seemed to match the land around them. It was as if he belonged here, in a way that she didn't. She had always felt like a stranger on this land, even though her family had worked hard to carve out a life here. But Jack seemed different. He seemed comfortable, at ease, in the wilderness. After a moment, Jack turned to leave. But before he did, he looked back at Emily. "You take care now," he said, his voice steady. And then, as if remembering something, he added, "Looks like you've got a heavy load there. Let me help you with that." Before Emily could respond, he was already at the door, holding it open for her. She stepped out into the cold morning air, and he followed, taking the sacks from her hands with ease. The roughness of his hands caught her attention, and for a brief moment, their fingers brushed. She felt a jolt run through her, though she wasn't sure why. There was something about him, something that made her feel both nervous and curious at the same time. She didn't know what it was, but she couldn't ignore it. Jack helped her load the sacks onto the wagon, his movements slow and deliberate. Once everything was secured, he straightened up and looked at her. "You take care of yourself, Miss Emily," he said softly. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the dusty street. Emily watched him for a moment, a strange feeling settling in her chest. She couldn't quite place it, but she knew that their paths had crossed for a reason. Maybe it was just a fleeting moment, just another face in a town full of strangers. But for some reason, it felt like more. She climbed into the wagon, the reins cold in her hands, and drove back toward the homestead. The day was still young, but her mind was already spinning with thoughts of the cowboy, Jack, whose roughened hands had touched hers for just a brief second. The encounter had been so simple, yet so strange, and she couldn't stop thinking about it. As the horse trotted down the road, Emily stared ahead at the endless horizon, wondering if their paths would cross again. The days following their first meeting seemed to stretch out endlessly, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in her. It wasn't anything she had planned or even fully understood, but her thoughts often wandered back to Jack. His calm demeanor, the roughness in his hands, the quiet strength that seemed to follow him like a shadow, it was all so different from the life she had known on the homestead. And that small moment when their hands had brushed, it lingered with her, a soft memory that refused to fade. Though Emily didn't know it at the time, Jack had noticed her too. She was different from the women he had encountered before. There was something about her that made her stand out, something warm and kind in her eyes, a gentleness that he found rare in the harsh, demanding life of the frontier. But, as with Emily, he couldn't quite explain why he thought of her so often after their brief interaction. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him, not with fear or indifference, but with curiosity. Or maybe it was the quiet strength in her, a strength that had been forged in the hard soil of the frontier. Days turned into weeks, and their paths crossed again in the most unexpected of ways. Emily was walking into town one afternoon, the sun beating down on her shoulders, when she noticed Jack sitting at the edge of the saloon. A few men gathered around him. He was leaning against the weathered wood of the building, a small grin tugging at the corner of his lips as he spoke to the men. It wasn't anything unusual cowboys like Jack often passed through, meeting with ranchers or traders. What caught Emily's attention wasn't just the sight of him, but the way he seemed so at home in this place, so comfortable among the rough and tumble men. She stood for a moment, just out of view, watching him. She wanted to approach, but wasn't sure what to say. The brief conversation they had shared at the general store had been enough to spark her curiosity, but she wasn't sure where to go from there. Would he even remember her? Would he care? As if reading her mind, Jack's gaze shifted toward her, his eyes locking onto hers across the street. For a second, Emily froze, feeling a rush of heat spread across her cheeks. He gave her a small, knowing smile, as if to say, "I see you." It was just a simple gesture, but to Emily, it felt like an invitation. Without thinking, she found herself walking toward him, her heart beating faster with each step. "Well, look who it is," Jack said as she approached, his voice warm and steady. The men around him looked at her curiously, but Jack waved them off with a friendly gesture. "The lady of the homestead," he said with a grin. "What brings you to town today?" Emily felt a slight flush on her cheeks but returned his smile. "Just picking up some things for my family," she replied, feeling a little more at ease. "I didn't expect to find you here." Yeah, I'm just finishing up some work with the fellas here," he said, his voice calm and easy. He didn't seem bothered by the attention of the men or Emily's sudden appearance. "But it's a good thing you showed up," he continued, looking at her with a glint in his eye. "I was just about to head over to the general store. Could use some company." Emily hesitated for just a moment. She had come to town for a reason, after all. But there was something about Jack's offer that felt right. Perhaps it was his quiet confidence, or maybe it was just the simple truth that she had been feeling lonely on the homestead, longing for a change of pace. Without thinking too much about it, she nodded. "All right, I could use a bit of a break," she said. The two of them walked together toward the general store, Jack leading the way with his long strides. They didn't talk much at first, but the silence was comfortable, not awkward. It was as if they had known each other for much longer than they actually had. Emily found herself looking up at Jack occasionally, studying the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, or how his worn boots kicked up dust with each step. He was a man of few words, but his presence filled the space between them in a way that made her feel more at ease than she had in a long time. When they reached the store, they paused for a moment outside the door. Jack looked at her, his expression softening. "You know, Emily," he said, "I've been thinking. Life out here on the frontier. It's tough, isn't it? Feels like you're always working just to stay afloat. But you seem to be handling it pretty well." His voice had an almost admiring tone, though he tried to mask it with a light-hearted shrug. Emily blinked, surprised by his words. "I try," she said, looking down at the ground. "It's not easy, but my family needs me. We all need to pull together, you know?" Jack nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "I get that," he said, his voice quieter now. "I've been out here for years, working the range, moving from place to place, always chasing the next job, the next cattle drive. It's hard, always being on the move, never staying in one place long enough to find something that feels like home." Emily glanced up at him, curious. She had always thought of cowboys as men who lived a life of adventure and freedom, always moving forward, always chasing something new. But hearing Jack speak, she realized there was a loneliness to it too. A deep, quiet kind of loneliness that perhaps only someone like him could understand. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked before she could stop herself. Her voice, gentle. Jack seemed to pause for a moment, then nodded. "I do," he said, his tone more serious than before. "But you can't stop. Not out here. There's always more to do. More work to be done. More miles to travel. It's a hard life. But it's the only one I know." They both stood there for a few moments in silence, letting the weight of Jack's words settle between them. For Emily, it was a moment of understanding. She had always felt the weight of the homestead on her shoulders, but Jack's life, as free as it seemed, was no easier. It was a different kind of struggle, one that she hadn't fully appreciated until now. Eventually, they entered the store, and the conversation shifted to more mundane matters. What they needed to pick up, what the town was like this time of year, and whether the weather would change soon. But despite the casual nature of the conversation, there was a new connection between them, one that neither of them could easily explain. As the afternoon wore on, Emily found herself enjoying Jack's company more than she had expected. He was funny, kind, and surprisingly easy to talk to. He didn't pressure her to speak more than she wanted, nor did he make her feel uncomfortable. There was a sense of calm in his presence, as though he had been through enough to know that some things needed to be said, and others left unsaid. Before long, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of orange and pink. Emily knew it was time to head home, but part of her didn't want the day to end. She had enjoyed spending time with Jack, and in some small way, it had made her feel less alone in the vast wilderness she called home. "Thanks for the company, Jack," she said, her voice a little quieter now. "I needed this." Jack gave her a gentle smile, tipping his hat. As they parted ways and she climbed into her wagon to head home, Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. She wasn't sure where this unexpected connection with Jack would lead. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like there might be something more waiting for her in this life on the frontier. Something worth waiting for. As the weeks passed, Emily and Jack continued to see each other around the town. Each encounter seemed more natural than the last. They spoke whenever they crossed paths, whether it was in the general store or outside the small saloon, or even when their journeys led them both to the post office. Though their conversations remained simple and often focused on daily life. The weather, the crops, the condition of the town, there was an undeniable comfort in their interactions. Jack's presence brought a kind of peace to Emily's otherwise demanding and sometimes lonely life. Jack, in turn, found himself looking forward to the moments when he would see her. At first, he had thought it would be like any other passing acquaintance, a simple exchange of words, and then back to the grind of work. But with Emily, it was different. She was different. There was something in the way she listened, the way she spoke with such kindness and understanding, that made him feel a sense of connection he hadn't felt in years. He admired her strength, the way she carried the weight of her family's struggles, always with a quiet grace. Though Jack often worked long hours, repairing fences or herding cattle for ranchers, he made a point to stop by the general store whenever he could, even if just to catch a glimpse of Emily. It was always in the briefest of moments, a simple wave from across the street, a shared smile that lasted just a little too long. It wasn't love. Not yet. But there was something growing between them. Something that neither of them could ignore. One particularly cold afternoon, as winter began to settle in, Emily's father came down with a bad fever. He had been working the fields in the bitter wind for days, trying to prepare for the coming snow, and his body had finally given way to the strain. Emily's mother did her best to care for him, but there was only so much she could do. Their home was small, and the fire was barely enough to keep the chill out. Emily found herself staying by her father's side, tending to him while trying to keep the house in order. There was so much to do, but all of it seemed impossible when the person who was supposed to be the pillar of the family was too ill to help. Emily didn't know what to do. She had tried to carry the burden alone, but it was more than she could bear. There were crops that needed to be gathered before the snow came, wood to chop, and fences to repair. Her father had always been the one to take charge of these things, and now that he was bedridden, the weight of it all pressed down on her. She felt trapped in a cycle of endless work, with no relief in sight. It was then that Jack appeared. It had been a few days since she had last seen him, and she hadn't even realized how much she had missed his company until she saw him standing outside her front door. He was on horseback, the reins tight in his hands, his boots dusted with snow. His broad shoulders were hunched against the cold, but there was a softness in his eyes that Emily had never noticed before. "Emily," he called softly, his voice carrying through the crisp air. "I heard about your father. Thought I might lend a hand." Emily had been standing at the edge of the barn, looking out at the distant fields. She had been debating whether or not she could manage another long day of work, but the sight of Jack seemed to clear her mind. For a moment, she felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. She didn't want to seem weak or helpless, but in that moment, she realized how much she needed help. "Jack," she said, surprised by the warmth that filled her chest at the sight of him. I didn't expect to see you." Jack nodded, dismounting his horse and walking toward her. "I figured you could use some company," he said, "and maybe a little help, too." She shook her head, feeling guilty. "I don't want to trouble you. There's so much to do around here." He smiled, his expression soft but firm. "You're not troubling me, Emily. I've been out here long enough to know how it feels to be overwhelmed. Sometimes, a person just needs another hand to get through it." Emily hesitated but felt something inside her stir. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, and it made her heart flutter. She didn't want to admit it, but she had been so lonely, so overwhelmed, and the idea of having someone there, someone who cared, was a relief she hadn't realized she needed so much. "All right," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. "Thank you, Jack." Together, they set to work. Jack took over some of the chores that Emily had been struggling with, chopping firewood and tending to the animals. He worked with a steady, quiet efficiency that Emily couldn't help but admire. She had always known that Jack was capable, but seeing him in action, his strength and skill, made her realize just how much he had to offer. There was something deeply comforting in the way he moved, like he knew exactly where his place was in the world. It was different from the way her father had always been. Her father had been the leader, the one who made the decisions. But Jack was something else. He was a steady presence, one that didn't demand, but simply gave, without expecting anything in return. As the day wore on, Emily found herself growing more and more comfortable in his presence. The tension that had been building inside her seemed to melt away with every chore they finished together. They worked side by side, rarely speaking, but their actions spoke volumes. Jack never asked for anything, never expected anything from her. He simply helped because he saw the struggle in her eyes, and that was enough. When the day came to a close, and the work was done, Emily found herself standing on the porch, watching as the last traces of daylight faded into the horizon. Jack had just finished the last of the chores, and now he stood beside her, looking out at the same view. "It's getting late," he said softly, his voice carrying in the stillness of the evening. "You've done enough for today." Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she hadn't fully allowed herself to feel. She had been too focused on the struggles of the frontier to realize that she had been longing for someone to share the burden with, someone who could understand the weight of it all. And now, standing here with Jack, she realized that she wasn't as alone as she had thought. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking at him. "You don't know how much this means to me." Jack met her gaze, his expression soft. "I think I do, Emily," he said, his voice low and steady. "I think I understand." And in that moment, Emily realized that she had begun to care for Jack in a way she hadn't planned. It wasn't just the comfort of his presence or the way he had helped her in a time of need. It was something deeper, something she hadn't expected. It was the way he made her feel seen, the way he didn't ask for anything in return, and the way he seemed to understand her, in a way no one else did. She didn't know where this would lead, or what the future held. But for the first time, in a long while, she felt like she wasn't alone in this world. As the evening settled into night, Emily and Jack stood side by side, sharing the silence. It wasn't awkward, nor was it uncomfortable. It was just the two of them, together in the quiet of the frontier, both uncertain of what the future held, but both knowing that, for now, they had each other. The winter months seemed to stretch on longer than usual. The cold winds that whipped across the plains carried a chill that seeped into every corner of Emily's small homestead. Her father's illness had come and gone, but he wasn't the same. The fever had left him weaker than before, and he couldn't work as he once had. It was a strain on the whole family, and Emily knew that she had to shoulder even more of the burden. Each day brought a new challenge. The animals to care for, the firewood to chop, the house to clean, and the crops that, despite the harsh weather, needed to be tended to. It seemed as though the work would never end, and Emily was starting to feel the weight of it all. It was during this difficult time that Jack's visits to the homestead became more frequent. At first, he had come just a few times to help with odd jobs, but over the past few weeks, he had started coming every few days. He didn't stay long, but every time he arrived, he offered a steady hand and quiet companionship. He helped fix the fences, repair the barn roof, and even chopped enough wood to last through the coldest of winters. It wasn't just the physical help that made a difference, though. Jack had a way of being there for Emily without saying much, simply offering a sense of calm when things seemed most overwhelming. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting day of working the fields, Emily found herself sitting by the fire, her hands sore from the labor. Her mother was in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner, and her father rested in the corner of the room, wrapped in a blanket. The quiet of the house was both comforting and suffocating. She longed for a moment of peace, a break from the never-ending tasks. She had been thinking about Jack a lot lately, more than she had ever allowed herself to admit. There was something about him that had slowly wormed its way into her heart. It wasn't just his kindness or his steady presence, it was the way he seemed to understand her, as though he knew exactly how it felt to be caught in the struggle of life on the frontier. Jack had never pressed her for anything. He hadn't asked for her love or attention, nor had he hinted at any feelings for her. He was content to help and let things unfold naturally, and Emily appreciated that. But as the days went by, she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something more between them. She wasn't sure what it was, but every time their hands brushed as they worked together, or when they shared a quiet moment by the fire, something inside her stirred. It was one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, that Jack came by once more to check on the homestead. Emily had been out in the barn, working to bring in some last supplies for the night. When she saw him standing at the door, looking as rugged and calm as always, her heart skipped a beat. She had grown so used to his presence, but tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. "Evening, Emily," Jack said, his voice warm despite the cold air. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're holding up." "I'm getting by," Emily replied with a tired smile. "It's been a long day, but we're managing." Jack's eyes lingered on her for a moment, and she felt a flutter in her chest. There was something in his gaze, a depth to his expression that made her heart race. She couldn't tell if it was the way he looked at her, or if it was the quiet intimacy they had developed over time. But in that moment, Emily knew that she couldn't ignore the feelings she had been trying to push away. "Your father?" Jack asked, his voice gentle. "Resting," Emily said, her voice softening. "He's not what he used to be. It's hard to watch him struggle." Jack nodded, his face darkening with understanding. "I know what that's like," he said quietly. "Seeing someone you care about lose their strength. It's a hard thing." They stood there for a moment, neither speaking, just letting the silence stretch between them. Emily felt her chest tighten, the weight of the unsaid words hanging in the air. She wanted to tell him everything the way she felt, the way he had slowly become her support, the way she had started to imagine a life with him in it. But something held her back. She didn't know what the future held for either of them. She was a settler, tied to her family's land, and Jack was a cowboy, a man of the open range who came and went as he pleased. How could they make a life together when their worlds were so different? Jack seemed to sense her hesitation. "I'm not here to tell you what to do, Emily," he said, his voice steady. "But I can see you're struggling, and I want you to know that I'm here for whatever you need. You don't have to carry all of this on your own." His words were simple, but they struck her deeply. It was more than just help with the work. It was an offer of companionship, of shared burdens, of something deeper. Emily looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never felt more torn in her life. On the one hand, she knew that Jack was right. She didn't have to face everything alone. But on the other hand, she couldn't ignore the reality of their situation. Jack was a cowboy. He had his own life, his own path. And Emily? She had a family to take care of. A homestead that needed her. She couldn't leave it behind, not for anything. "I know, Jack," she said quietly, her voice almost breaking. "But I can't leave. Not right now. I have to stay. My family needs me." Jack didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at her with an understanding that made her feel both comforted and saddened. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I know you do, Emily," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know. But you deserve more than this, more than just a life of hard work and constant struggle. You deserve someone who sees you for who you really are." Emily swallowed hard, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She hadn't realized how much she had wanted to hear those words, how much she had longed for someone to acknowledge the pain she had kept hidden for so long. "I don't know what the future holds, Jack," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I can't leave this life. Not yet. Not when my family needs me." Jack stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I understand," he said softly. "But you're not alone, Emily. Not as long as I'm around. I'll help as much as I can. And if you ever need something more, you know where to find me." The weight of his words settled over her, and for the first time in weeks, Emily felt a sense of peace. She wasn't ready to leave the homestead. She couldn't. But Jack had offered her something precious, an understanding that there was more to life than just surviving. There was living, too. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to live this life with his quiet support at her side. As Jack turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Take care of yourself, Emily," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the evening mist, leaving Emily standing in the doorway with her heart full of conflicted feelings. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if there was a future for her and Jack. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a choice. The path ahead wasn't clear, but it was hers to decide. The winter months slowly began to fade, and with the change of season, a new chapter seemed to unfold in Emily's life. The snow that had blanketed the land melted away, giving way to the muddy, spring-blooming earth beneath. The cold winds turned to warmer breezes, and the days grew longer, brighter. Yet despite the welcome changes of spring, something in Emily felt unsettled, as if the calm of nature couldn't quiet the storm inside her heart. Jack had been a steady presence through the long winter, offering help whenever he could, working side by side with her, and providing the kind of quiet support Emily hadn't known she needed. They had become close, and though their bond had been unspoken, it was clear to both of them that something deeper was growing between them. But as the days turned into weeks, Emily couldn't ignore the truth of her life, her responsibilities, her duties to her family, and the homestead that depended on her. She couldn't leave. Not yet. Not when so much needed to be done. And certainly not when her father's health was still fragile. Jack, too, seemed to understand that. But the distance between them grew slowly, like the pull of a tide that cannot be stopped. His visits became less frequent as the call of the open range grew stronger. The spring cattle drives were beginning, and he had to return to his life on the road. As much as Emily wanted to hold on to what they had, the reality of their different worlds kept pushing them apart. One evening, after the sun had set and the sky had turned a soft pink and orange, Jack arrived at the homestead for what Emily knew might be the last time for a while. He had a bag packed on his horse, ready to ride out at dawn to join the cattle drive. This time, there was a heaviness between them, a kind of quiet sadness that neither of them knew how to put into words. Emily had finished some chores earlier and was sitting on the porch, watching the last of the daylight slip away, when she heard Jack's familiar voice. "Evening, Emily," he called softly as he approached. His tone was gentle, as though he didn't want to disturb the peace that hung around them. Yet it was clear there was something unspoken in the air. "Evening, Jack," Emily replied, rising from her seat. She tried to smile, but it felt forced. It wasn't that she didn't want him to leave. She knew he had to. It was the way their time together had felt so fleeting, so fragile. Jack stood before her, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for something. Emily felt a pang in her chest, a bittersweet mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I'm heading out early tomorrow," Jack said, his voice low. "The cattle drive's starting. I'll be gone for a while." Emily nodded, though a lump formed in her throat. She had known this day was coming, but now that it was here, it felt heavier than she had imagined. She had grown so used to his presence in her life, the quiet companionship he provided, that the thought of him leaving made her feel as though something important was being taken away. "I'll miss you," she whispered, her voice barely above a sigh. Jack stepped closer, his gaze softening. "I'll miss you too, Emily," he said quietly. He paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words, before adding, "But I want you to know something. I understand. You've got your family, your homestead. I can't ask you to leave all that behind. It's a hard life, but it's the life you've chosen." Emily felt a surge of emotion, part relief, part sadness. It was as if Jack had understood her struggle all along, without her ever having to explain it. He knew that her loyalty was to her family and to the land. And though he had never pressured her for more, never asked her to choose between him and her life on the homestead, she knew he would always carry a part of her heart with him, just as she would carry a piece of him with her. "I never wanted to choose, Jack," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I never wanted to have to choose between you and my family. But I can't leave. Not yet. I have to stay. They need me." "I know," Jack said quietly. "I know you do. And that's why I've never asked you to come with me. I wouldn't want you to choose something like that. It's not fair to ask." They stood in silence for a long moment, both of them struggling with the same unspoken truth that their time together had been beautiful, but fleeting. Emily had always known deep down that Jack's life was one of constant motion, of open skies and long roads. It wasn't a life that could be shared with someone tied to the land, to a homestead. And yet, in the quiet moments they had shared, she had begun to wonder if it could have been. She had begun to wonder what it would be like to travel with him, to leave behind the confines of her small world for something bigger. But that was a dream, a fantasy that could never be realized. She had responsibilities. She had to stay. "I'll always remember you, Emily," Jack said, breaking the silence. "Always." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, and she quickly blinked them away, not wanting to show weakness. "I'll remember you too, Jack. And I'll never forget what you did for me. For us." Jack's eyes softened, and he reached out, taking her hand gently in his. His roughened hands felt warm against hers, a comfort she had come to depend on. They stood there for a moment, simply holding hands, as though they both needed the connection. The reassurance that this wasn't goodbye forever. "I'll be back one day," Jack said softly, his voice full of promise. "When the time's right, I'll come back. And if you're still here, if you still need me, I'll be here too." Emily nodded, her heart aching with the weight of his words. "I'll be waiting," she whispered. Not sure if she believed it, but needing to say it all the same. Jack gave her a soft smile. And for a moment, the sadness between them seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of peace. He leaned down, his lips brushing her forehead in a gentle kiss. It wasn't a passionate kiss, but a quiet one, full of everything they had shared and everything they still could never have. With that, Jack turned away and mounted his horse, his silhouette fading into the distance as he rode off toward the setting sun. Emily stood there, watching him go, her heart heavy with a mixture of love, loss, and longing. In the days that followed, life on the homestead returned to its usual rhythm. Emily threw herself into the work, caring for her family, tending to the animals, and repairing the damage winter had left behind. But there was an emptiness now. A quiet space where Jack's presence had once been. She missed him, more than she had expected, but she knew that he had done for her what no one else had. He had shown her that it was okay to be strong, but it was also okay to lean on someone, to let someone help carry the burden, even if only for a little while. Years passed, and Emily continued to live on the homestead. Her family grew older, and the days became more routine. Every now and then, she would find herself standing by the window, looking out at the horizon, wondering where Jack was, if he was safe, and if he ever thought of her. She had no way of knowing, but she carried the memory of him with her, a gentle reminder of what could have been, and what they had shared. One spring, long after the last time Jack had left, a letter arrived at the homestead. It was postmarked from a town far away, and Emily recognized the handwriting immediately. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it, hoping for news, hoping that maybe Jack had returned, or at least left a trace of his journey behind. "Emily," it began, "I've thought of you often. I don't know when or how, but one day I'll return. Until then, know that you'll always have a place in my heart. You helped me remember that there's more to life than just moving forward. You've shown me what it means to care for something, to build something, and to stay. I hope you found peace in your world, as I've found mine in the wide open spaces. Take care, Emily. Always. Jack." She folded the letter and held it close to her chest. Though she had known that Jack would never stay forever, she realized, in that moment, that he had left her with something that could never fade: his memory, his words, and the love they had shared, no matter how brief.